The past 7 days may go down in history as a week of federal government shutdown. But at the state level, this was a week in voter suppression. North Carolina's new voting law, the most restrictive in the nation, is the target of a Justice Department lawsuit filed in federal court on Monday. The suit is challenging key provisions of the law: strict voter ID requirements, cutbacks in early voting days, the elimination of same-day registration, and a ban on provisional ballots cast outside a voter's home precinct. The department is also asking that North Carolina be required to get federal clearance before making any further changes to its voting laws. Meanwhile, in Virginia, just 1 month in advance of the state's highly contested governor's race, a federal lawsuit is challenging a purge list that struck 57,000 voters from the rolls. The Virginia Democratic Party has named Governor Bob McDonnell and Attorney General and Republican gubernatorial candidate Ken Cuccinelli in the suit, which claims many of the purge voters are, in fact, eligible to vote on November 5th. Judith, seriously. On the one hand, right, you have the federal government sort of engage in this make-believe madness, but this is real, right? What's going on in terms of voter suppression, particularly in these border states, right? Virginia, North Carolina, these are swing states.
Right. I mean, it's great that the Department of Justice jumped into North Carolina. You know, Advancement Project filed a suit on behalf of the North Carolina NAACP, and now here comes the Justice Department actually, being aggressive again. They filed in Texas, which, by the way, is stayed. They filed a motion to stay it because of the shutdown. They can't move forward in litigation. But they filed this case in North Carolina, which is like exactly the same case that we filed. And it's good to have we, the people, actually on the side of voters.
You said aggressive. I want to listen to Attorney General Eric Holder, because he sort of laid down the gauntlet as he talked about North Carolina and the ways in which he fully plans for this to be indicative of what he would do in other states. Let's listen for a moment.
To other states considering voting restrictions like North Carolina's, I want to say this. I and my colleagues at every level of the Justice Department will never hesitate to do all that we must do to protect the constitutionally guaranteed civil rights of all Americans.
That is pretty clear.
Well, sure. I mean, what we're talking about now is if this law in North Carolina were to prevail, I think you could arguably say that whatever government came out of it was illegitimate, certainly in the context of our Constitution and all that. But the other one to look at is Virginia, which, of course, you just brought up. It's an interesting issue there, and I think it's kind of a slam dunk legally. The state has said that each county can decide whether to enforce the provisions of it. So it's an easy argument to make in court that this provides unequal protection under the law. So I think that this one is so blatant. By the way, it has to do with duplicate residences, which is really foolish when you think about it, because people move around the country all the time.
And the problem with that case is that, trying to purge right before an election, a little dicey, because it's usually for political reasons.
And in fact, it's interesting because McCrory says, or rather McDonnell says, no, actually, this is, this is the politics here are happening as a result of so this is McCrory in North Carolina, right? Saying, no, the politics are on the side of the Justice Department. Let's listen for a moment.
I recently saw a video of President Obama voting in Chicago. And one of the first things he did was show a video ID, a photo ID. One of the first things President Obama did was show a voter ID. And I believe if showing a voter ID is good enough and fair enough for our own president in Illinois, then it's good enough for the people of North Carolina.
That is just intellectually dishonest, right? That is just not what it's. I mean, the president may have shown an ID, but in Illinois, there's a very open law. You can also show any sorts of, right? You can show a utility bill.
Right.
There's also,
the thing is that North Carolina law is not just the ID.
No.
It's like the kitchen sink of voter suppression.
Yes.
It rolls back early voting. It cuts same-day registration. 70% of African Americans who voted in 2012 actually voted by early voting. And so this was taking it back in a state where turnout, they have the 11th highest turnout in the country in 2012. And so this is about going backwards because they're scared about moving forward.
I want to ask you, Raul, you are still enthusiastic, still at least vaguely optimistic about the possibility of immigration reform. What about the idea that this Congress could give us a new Section 4 formula? They could develop a formula since it was sent back from the Supreme Court. Do you think this Congress, after it gets over itself, could give us a formula that will work?
I'm not sure about that. I would like to be optimistic, but now that we are in the post-Shelby County world, we don't know this. You know, with this Congress, there's so many wild cards. And what's so troubling to me, I am, you know, as Judith mentioned, I am also very happy that the DOJ is pursuing this. But what's so troubling in the post-Shelby County world, now before, when we had pre-clearance for states, the burden of proof was on states to show that they were not disenfranchising voters. Now it's flipped, and that multiplies the effort required by the Department of Justice to stop these laws. And this law is, you know, if Ari Berman were here, I was reading one of his articles, you know, he's the expert on this. He says it's like the mother of all voter suppression laws. And it even, although they require government ID, very interesting, they do not accept government ID for public workers or government ID issued to someone who's on public assistance. So it's so blatant.
And what's really insidious is this is just an anti-democratic way to keep power. The states that are doing that are trying to eliminate all the voters who might inconveniently vote against them and all that kind of thing. And that is, as I said, is extremely insidious, and it's particularly notable in Virginia. You have a close race for governor there, and here at the last minute they're coming in and trying to suppress vote that would in all probability go to the Democrats.
And because it really is fine to win because you convinced more people to your side. I mean, like, you know, it's a democracy. Right. It's a democracy. It's even reasonable to say, okay, I have a better ground game. I get more of my voters out, right? But that's very different than the notion.
Do it this way. Change the rules of the game so that people. And this isn't.
It's also less sexy.
And we have to understand it's not just about now, right? It's about this changing electorate. And if you can line up the rules to keep people disenfranchised for years to come, then you can slow down where this country is going.
And because it's more complicated and it feels technical and nerdy, it can be hard to get people to focus in on this, right? I mean,
except in North Carolina.
Except in North Carolina, where Reverend Barber has gotten moral mundane themselves just into ad infinitum. Judith Browne Dianis and Benjy Sarlin, thank you so much for joining us today. Coming up, is that Ari Berman? No, it's not, but we'll page Ari Berman later. Will the real John Boehner please stand up? We'll take a closer look at the House Speaker's rise to power and how he's dealing with the pressure right now. Plus, the early prognosis for Obamacare, tough medicine for Republican critics. There is more Nerdland at the top of the hour.